Hello, good morning Pacific Coasters, good afternoon East Coasters, midday to our Central Time Zone members. Get you started here in just a moment. We're gonna give everyone a few seconds to get authenticated, get the sound connecting for them. We're doing Preparing for a CEO Transition today in our weekly member webinar series. I'm gonna introduce Mike Frommelt. He's the founder of Strategic Talent Partners. Do a few housekeeping notes here and then I'm gonna hand it off. Mike, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to you and Strategic Talent Partners. You make our weekly member webinar series possible. These webinars are free every single Tuesday for all of our members. That means that if there's someone in your company that you think could benefit from this type of education, like I said, we do it every single week, please reach out to our membership team. Contact information is here. We can quickly add them to your membership so that they can attend these free as part of your membership every week. We want this to be engaging. We'll take questions as we can throughout the content. There's a Q&A function. Please input your questions there or in the chat, and I will get them over to Mike once he finishes content on each slide. We have two types of continuing education credit available today. We have SHRM and generic. You have to be here for 60 minutes, the entire 60 minutes of the webinar to be eligible for that credit. We'll launch 3 polling questions intermittently throughout the presentation today. You must answer and respond to all of those polling questions to be eligible for that credit today. And you had to have put that you wanted the CE credit. Otherwise, we don't know that you wanted that. If for some reason you didn't put a CE credit type at your registration time, email eventhelp@nco.org. During this webinar. We usually process it directly after and get it to you within 2 hours. This webinar and the slides is being recorded. You can grab the slides now and follow along, nco.org/live webinars. If you'd like the slides, they're already posted. Again, recording will be sent to you by end of the day, usually within 2 hours of the processing of the webinar. And we have a bunch of upcoming fun stuff for you guys in terms of webinar and our annual conference. We've got navigating an ESOP transaction, as well as a bilingual community conversation next Thursday. That's free webinar for anyone, both members and non-members. And of course, make sure you join Mike and myself and everyone at Strategic Talent Partners at our annual employee ownership conference in Salt Lake City, April 14th through the 17th. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to you, Mike. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Let's see if I can do this correctly. Hopefully I can.
All right, you're going to want to scroll back just a couple slides. We're kind of in the middle.
I'm in trouble.
There you go.
There we go. Sorry about that. Well, good morning, everyone, and on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. I'm Mike Frommelt. I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I don't know if any of you have it colder than we have it here, but we're at -5 right now. We were at -15 this morning, so hopefully it's warmer wherever you are. Just to tell you a little bit about my background, just as I think as a kind of to understand where I'm coming from in terms of our webinar here today. You may recognize my name from my previous company. I started and owned and ran a company called Keystone Search for 22 years. And at Keystone Search, we did exclusively C-level recruiting and consulting. We have a specialty ESOP practice working with ESOPs. And so I've been working with ESOPs for almost 20 years and have helped a lot of ESOPs through these strategic transitions, these CEO transitions. In April of last year, so almost a year ago, I merged my company, Keystone, with another company here out of Minneapolis that was called Core Talent. And Core Talent was also a executive recruiting firm and consulting firm that worked at leadership levels in the organization. And so the two companies coming together, we created Strategic Talent Partners. And what we do is we really help organizations hiring at all levels, all leadership levels in the organization, and still work very heavily with ESOPs and really love the ESOP environment. What I'm going to talk through today, I'm going to use this as kind of a framework. This is a called the ESOP CEO Transition Roadmap. This is a roadmap that I built a few years ago after having that experience, as I mentioned, working through a lot of CEO transitions with ESOPs. I really looked back and said which ones of these really worked out the best, were the smoothest, most successful transitions. And what I realized is there's some commonality in the ones that went really, really well. And so this roadmap will kind of walk us through sort of the ideal scenario, if you could do sort of everything right at exactly the right time to make this transitions go as smoothly as possible. But I understand that that never do they go perfectly, and everyone that I've worked on never goes perfectly. But so I don't want this to scare anyone, in terms of that, if you haven't done some of these activities in the right time frame, or that they're reversed, or whatever you've done, whatever's happened in your organization, that it's, it's not going to work out, that it's, a terrible situation. But this will just give us kind of a framework to walk through kind of that ideal sort of scenario of what I've seen in my experience over the last 20 years. And I'm going to walk through these step by step. Oops. But before I jump into kind of the roadmap and the actual steps and activities in each of these steps, one will just kind of lay out for you, who's involved in these and who's driving these kinds of transitions. One of the most important things I think to understand, and if I could leave you with just one thing today, is that the board is extremely important. The board is really the driver of these CEO transitions. So if you were to go out and look at, just look in Google and say, what does a board of directors do? You'll see some quotes like this. The most important job of the board is to choose a CEO. CEO succession is the #1 rule of the board. And a change of CEO is one of the most crucial events in the life of the company. And I absolutely agree with all of these. As if you think about it, when you're going through one of these transitions, you are really at a pretty vulnerable stage as an organization, because if you think about how your top leadership is connected to your employee owners, your customers, your vendors, everything that you do in the organization is very connected to that senior leadership and senior leader. And so when you're making that change, it's normal that the organization is going to be anxious, the employee owners are going to be anxious, customers are going to be anxious. And so it's important that you do these things thoroughly and think them through. But again, most important thing to understand here is that this is a board decision. So I have a lot of times that outgoing CEO is a member of the board, maybe even the chair of the board. And I guess one of the important things I want to make clear here today is that when you're choosing your next CEO, that it's not driven solely by the outgoing CEO. That really this needs to be a board decision. Obviously, that outgoing CEO is not going to be in the organization anymore, but choosing a CEO is a board decision overall. Some of the other key roles are the outgoing. Of course, there's going to be a role for the outgoing and retiring CEO, and that role is going to be more consultative and sort of developmental along the way, and I'll explain what that means here in a little bit. You also have specific things that you want your service providers to be involved in, some specific tactics and to-dos that you want from your trustee, from your accountants, from your attorneys, and so forth. And then, of course, your human resources department should be involved in these transitions as well. And they're going to play more of a coordination kind of development role. And again, I will explain kind of what I mean by that here as we go forward. And I do want to say that I'm open to taking any questions along the way as well. So if there's anything that pops into your mind that you'd like to ask, please do so. And Jamie's going to be watching those for me and make sure that I see that those questions are coming across.
Nothing as of yet, Mike. You are
nothing as of yet. Okay, terrific. And I apologize. I'm getting over a cold, so I'm going to need to take a drink of water every once in a while. But if my voice fades out, please somebody raise their hand on the chat, please.
You're doing great.
All right. Okay. So polling question number one, the most appropriate person to lead the transition process is A, the retiring or outgoing CEO, B, the board of directors, or C, the human resources department.
Polling question number one has been launched. Again, if you are looking for that SHRM or generic designation continuing education credit, it is required. We'll leave it up for about 30 seconds to ensure that everyone that would like that credit has the opportunity to answer. And the scenario will be the same going forward for the other two questions. I will make sure to prompt you all. Thanks for reading those, Mike. Got another 15 seconds or so. We've got 81% participation. Again, even if you don't want the CE credit, let us know that you're in the room and that you're alive. It helps us out. All right, that last 12% of you, I believe in you. Thank you. We're getting thumbs up for that.
Frozen, Jamie. They're here in the Midwest.
Oh no.
I
Yes, we
believe
need
they're
to
all
warm them up.
fingers are frozen.
All right, I'm going to end the poll here, Mike, and here are the results so that you can acknowledge them.
Okay, good. But it looks like most of you got this one. So the most appropriate person to lead the CEO transition process is the board of directors. You probably shouldn't say person, it should say people to drive the process. The retiring and outgoing CEO is certainly going to have a role along the way, but they are having the outgoing CEO driving that process solely is I have found has been problematic. There's a lot of things that's going to happen to that CEO as they get closer to their retirement, and a lot of things coming at them. And quite honestly, it's really kind of not even fair to have them completely driving that process. Most organizations that I work with will actually have a subsection of their board that would be set up as a search committee. That could be specific search committee for the succession or transition process, or sometimes if there's a nominating governance committee, they may act in that capacity as you're going up to a CEO transition. But we'll kind of get into that a little bit here too. Okay. Sorry, Jamie, I'm not seeing. Oh, they're there. Okay, got it. Okay. This sometimes scares folks when I say that start planning for the CEO transition 4 to 5 years out from when that transition is happening. Again, I don't mean this to scare you, but it's amazing how fast 4 to 5 years goes by. And I do understand that not always does the CEO understand exactly when they're going to be leaving when it's this far out. But the first step in getting prepared for these transitions is really to make sure that you have a well-functioning board of directors. And I believe that getting that in place 4 to 5 years out from that transition time is important. You need to have, what I have found is that I believe that you need to have outside, at least one independent director. I actually prefer 2 independent directors that are coming from outside. It's very difficult for a completely internal board of directors to choose their next boss. And so going through the process with having some independent directors is really important. They bring a lot of experience and exposure, and then also can be more objective than a full internal board of directors. You should have a solid governance structure in place, your bylaws and your articles of incorporation, your guidelines and so forth, and your expectations for board directors. A lot of times they will come into an organization, to an ESOP, and the board is really operating as kind of sort of a board of directors, talking about ownership issues and strategy issues, or sometimes kind of a mishmash of operational issues and sales issues and things like that. And it's really kind of a mishmash of a management meeting and a board directors meeting. So making sure that your board is operating at the right level, operating on looking at those ownership issues, bigger strategy issues, vision issues, those kinds of things in terms of your board is important. And then having a board review process as well. So making sure that you have the appropriate board directors in place and people that are really providing value to your organization as a board director. So I say that starting this out from 4 to 5 years out, because the board does need some time to kind of gel and start working together before you really dive into some of these transition type activities. So we got on to 3 to 4 years out from the transition. So this is when to really start these discussions of, at the board level only regarding transition and succession. So what is our potential timelines and formats? So when does that CEO want to be retired? And again, I know that might not be 100% clear at 4 years out from that transition, exactly when that transition date is going to be. But starting to talk about this, what does this look like? When is the appropriate time? And then by format, what I mean is there going to be some transition period? Are we going to have, a time where the outgoing CEO will work part-time? Will they remain on the board? Will they step away from the board completely? Will they be gone somewhere and on a beach somewhere, never to be seen again? So thinking about how this will happen, starting to talk about it at the board level, 3 to 4 years out. It's also the time to start talking about the goals then for the transition period. We have 3 to 4 years before we're actually going to make this transition. What is those goals for the business? What things need to be accomplished in the business to make sure that we're set well for transitioning to a new CEO? This is also the time to start discussing potential successors in the organization. So the board, obviously, if you have independent board directors in particular, they need to create some access to the senior leadership team members of the organization, so that the board directors can get some exposure to the abilities, capabilities of those senior leadership team members. Oftentimes we'll see in boards that are running very well that those senior leadership team members are making presentations on a quarterly basis or attending board meetings for whatever reason, or possibly serving on committees. That's a great way for the board directors to get some access and understanding kind of the potential for internal candidates for the CEO role. This is also the time to make sure that you have a strong strategic plan in place. So some organizations, you may need to build a strategic plan. Others, it may be a revision of your current strategic plan. This will be a really important component of the transition process. In fact, I want to talk a little bit more about strategic planning. I think everybody knows what strategic planning is, the ongoing process and roadmap for taking us from one place to another. But the key thing here about strategic planning is it's really difficult to understand what the CEO, your next CEO, should look like unless you know where the business is going. So if we're looking at candidates for a CEO position, that CEO may look a little bit different than the current CEO that you have today. And I think this is one of probably the biggest mistakes that I see in the transition processes is we sort of look inside the organization and say, who's the next Bill or the next Bob? Bob has been here for 25 years, has done a fantastic job, has grown the organization from whatever it may be, $10 million to $50 million in revenue, and has tripled the number of employee owners in that time frame. And then we start looking inside and saying, okay, who's the next Bob? But really what we need to be looking at is looking out further and saying, okay, what's the organization going to look like? It's probably a little bit different than what Bob brought to the table, because the right person to go from 10 to 50 million, it's not always the right kind of skill set to go from 50 million to 100 million or whatever that plan calls for. So it's really important that as you get going with this transition process, that you have a strategic plan, a solid strategic plan in place, knowing where the organization's going. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? You think, Jamie?
Nothing at this point. Everything seems clear.
So moving down a little bit closer in that 2 to 3 years time frame from the transition. So now we're going to really focus heavily on getting to that sort of, what does that CEO, the next CEO, look like? One of the things that I really like to do with my clients, and like to see ESOP organizations in general to do as part of this process, is really what we call building that org chart of the future. This is an exercise where you take all the names off of the current org chart, and we just build a functional org chart for the future. So in using some of the numbers I used before, we're now at 50. We're saying we're a $50 million a year ESOP, and our strategic plan over the next 5 to 7 years calls for us to be a 75 or $80 million ESOP, that we're going to grow that much. And the exercise here then is to build the ideal org chart for the $80 million a year ESOP, putting the functional titles in, or the functional areas into the business, but not putting any names in there and filling in names of the people that we already have in some of these slots. And what this does is it really points out very quickly where the kind of the gaps are in the organization, and also points out where the development needs are and so forth. And then from there, it allows us to work up toward the top of the organization and say, okay, if each of our functional areas, if this is what the functional head of sales needs to look like to be in the $80 million company, this is what the functional head of finance, operations, marketing, and so forth, then here's what the CEO needs to be capable of to run the $80 million a year ESOP. And so this is a really illuminating process, and you know, a lot of positive comes out of this. And the idea is, again, to come back to what is that CEO profile? What are those things that this person's going to need to be capable of to not only run the $80 million, but hopefully be able to take it further than that as well, to continue to grow the organization. So what are those key skill sets, experiences, and abilities that tie back to that strategic plan that we need to get from the next CEO? Okay, polling question number 2. The best time to start planning for a CEO transition is 6 months prior to the transition, 1 year prior to the transition, or 4 to 5 years from the transition.
Thanks, Mike. Polling question number 2 has been launched. Again, if you want that CE credit in any shape or form, it is required to answer this question. I saw some of you put it in a Q&A box last time. If you could use this prompt box, that would be helpful for us in reporting at the end. You guys are very fast this time. Thank you very much. If there's anyone else that's able to answer the question, we'd love to get 100% participation before we end here. Give you 5 or 10 more seconds. All right, we've got a solid lean here. Good group listening to you, Mike. There we go.
Okay, terrific. Yes, so 4 to 5 years from the transition is the right answer here. Again, don't mean that to scare anybody. It seems like a long ways out, but amazing how fast that time goes by, and important to understand that 4 to 5 years out is really in making sure you have that solid board in place, and allowing them to be able to work together for a little while before you start moving into some of the transition activities.
All right, I've got a couple of questions here for you. First one is, what do you do when a retiring CEO wants a particular person, in parentheses here, his son or favorite employee, to be the new CEO, but the other board members and the trustee believe someone else should lead the company?
Okay, well, first you have to act very diplomatically, very carefully. That's a great question. I think what's really important is that the board of directors has, again, if we really come back to how are these decisions made, the board of directors really has to be the one making that decision. So I've seen this situation before, and there's a way to handle it in terms of making sure you have an objective process of looking at candidates, and it may turn out that candidate is the one that that all believe is the best candidate for the job. And maybe that wasn't part of the question. It sounds like maybe there's already some disagreement in terms of that. But I think the board really needs to be, has to be the one that makes that final decision. It has to be the whole board. So hopefully there's some strong members of that board that can present their case in terms of why that candidate may not be the best fit and who the best candidate may be. But the board really has to coalesce around that decision and make that decision. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Mike. Going like even farther, like back upstream, any advice on how to start when you currently have no board or strong owner overseeing anything?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really kind of that 4 to 5 years out piece that I talked about in terms of getting that board in place. When you're facing a transition like this, when transition is coming up, it is really important that you have a solid board in place. And I like to have at least a couple of independent directors. I have also seen that you can not necessarily bring people onto the board. If you needed to do this in transition in a little bit faster time frame, you could bring people from outside onto a search committee. That doesn't necessarily have to be a full board director, but you could create a search committee with some independent members on that search committee as well that would run and drive that process. But yes, the ideal would be to have that strong board in place and before you even start discussing and working toward the transition.
Perfect. We can move ahead. We've got a couple more questions, but we'll save them for down the line. I believe you're probably going to touch on a few of them.
Okay, getting a little closer here. So still 2 to 3 years out from that transition period. So now, after if you've gotten the board has gotten some exposure to the senior leadership team members. Now it's time to start diving in a little bit deeper on, do we have internal candidates or not? So that means evaluating the current leadership against your new CEO profile. So you've now built the profile. You've gone through the exercises to make sure you have the right CEO profile, what that looks like for the future, and then assessing those internal leadership team members, senior leadership team members against that new CEO profile. Now, there's a number of different ways to do this. There's some great industrial psychology assessments out there like the Hogan, Omni, DDI. 360-degree review process is also a great thing to do here in terms of really understanding how those senior leadership team members interact throughout the business. So getting a review on kind of what do we have on the senior leadership team today as far as internal candidates. And then you're also going to be able to see kind of what those gaps are for those internal candidates, what they need to develop over the next 2 to 3 years to really be capable of being that next CEO. So that's where in here creating that training and development for any gaps that are seen here. That can be a variety of things in terms of creating mentoring programs for them, coursework, things they might need to go back to school for, and also just pairing them up with spending more time with the CEO, the retiring CEO, maybe a potential way to do some of this as well. It really depends on kind of what those gaps are and whether they're sort of leadership gaps or technical gaps or what those gaps are. So as we get down to the 1 year to 18 months away from the actual transition, now the board really needs to look at, have we made progress on the internal candidates? Have they been able to develop and close some of those gaps in terms of being real candidates for the CEO job? And this is time to create your recruiting or your hiring plan. Make some decisions. Are we going to look only at internal candidates? Are we going to look at a combination of internal and external candidates? Or if we determine that there's really not anyone that we feel is capable of stepping into that role on the inside, and we're going to look at only at external candidates. I would say that the great majority of clients that I work with actually are doing a combination of internal and external, and a lot of the projects that we work on, we are evaluating internal candidates sort of against the external candidates in terms of at the board level. And so that's most often how I see it happen, but certainly there's situations that are internal only or external only as well. Here's the time to build a list of goals and objectives for the outgoing CEO. So we're only a year to 18 months away now. What are those key transition items that we need to make sure that outgoing CEO takes care of? This is a lot of times working with clients, vendors, customers, handing things off inside the organization. Sometimes we'll see that CEOs are still actually maintaining a certain number of clients that they're working with and so forth, a number of relationships. And so handing those off inside the organization, making sure that, they're ready for leaving the organization. And then identifying an appropriate overlap time. So what is that overlap time between the outgoing CEO and the incoming CEO? And there's not a silver bullet answer to what I've seen as the best for this. I think if it's an outside candidate, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 months really kind of makes the most sense. Sometimes in an internal situation, an internal candidate situation, that transition time might be a little bit longer. But I think if you make it too long, you start to create confusion in the organization, kind of who the CEO is, and create some situations where you may have people going to two different people for answers, or two different people for communication and so forth. So this is something that just needs to be discussed at the board level. It really depends on the situation of the organization and the transition itself.
Mike, I've got 3 questions that really kind of hit in this time frame while we're on this slide. It's hard to address the priority here. Let's see. First one is, how do you address, or how would the board of directors address a situation in which the CEO must transition on a shorter notice, say due to retirement or illness?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an unfortunate situation, obviously. And generally what I have seen is that's the time to bring in some sort of an interim situation. So whether that's an interim individual coming from the outside into a CEO role, or someone on the board stepping into an individual, stepping into the CEO role for an interim amount of time, generally is how to do that. I think that if it's happening quickly like that, it doesn't allow for enough time to kind of go through some of these steps and stages. And so putting someone in that interim CEO slot until you can go through a real process to identify who's the right CEO going forward is the best way to do that.
This is an excellent transition then to how can an ESOP specifically mitigate the risk of hiring an outside or new CEO candidate without knowing whether they'll be a good cultural fit?
Yeah. So that's one of the really key things that we focus on in terms of making sure that we're bringing the right cultural fit candidates to the table. And the way that we do that, and the way that you can do that internally as well, if you're doing your search internally, is is to make sure that you're tying in your core values and your culture into every part of this process. So as you're meeting with candidates, interviewing candidates, setting up your CEO profile, your culture and your core values really need to be part of all of those. And sometimes that's almost difficult for organizations even to understand. A lot of times we might have a core value statement on our website that we put together, and we all kind of know what the culture is and what it feels like because we've been there for a long time, but it's sometimes hard to really describe it and really to utilize it. So one of the things we help our clients with is to really focus on those core values and how do we really behave on a day-to-day basis, and then tie that into all of the interviewing that you do both internally and externally. So you're making sure you're not just asking questions about, technical questions on sales or finance or whatever those may be, that you're asking questions around core values, how they've behaved, how they've led teams, how they've driven change, those kinds of things. And then you also want to be able to ultimately check that with references and other things as well, and doing that in a behavioral interviewing fashion. So that's the best answer I can give to that, is that it just has to be sort of tied in and part of the process from the very beginning, and making sure you're focusing on as much on that as you are on the technical skill set. Is there another question there, Jamie?
I think this is good for now. We do have quite a bit coming in, but I want you to move along and then we can try and get to some of them.
Great. All right. So now we're really getting real. We're down to the 3 months to 9 months from transition. So 7 to 9 months out, this is when you really do start your recruiting interviewing process. So if you're utilizing an outside firm like myself, this is the time to get started. with them. If you're doing it internally, this is also the time to really start looking at how are we going to be, how many candidates are we looking at internally or externally if you're running the search from internally, running the search from your HR department or so forth, or from your board. How are we going to bring in candidates? What hiring process, what interview process are they going to go through and so forth? You know, those processes for us, it does take about 9 months, really, to 8 to 9 months to really get through completely and have that person in the chair. So you want to be thinking about these things further out. It's not just a matter of interviewing 4 or 5 candidates and choosing one, especially at the senior executive level. So there's a multi-stage process that you want to go through. Again, you want to make sure you're tying in your core values and your culture into that process and making sure you're getting numerous heads involved. The way that we do it, of course, the board is running the process and the board is going to make that ultimate decision, but we do get employee owners involved in the interviewing process. We have 3 stages of interviewing that candidates go through to make sure that we've sort of turned these candidates upside down and inside out and really understand them both from a technical, leadership, and values perspective before we make any hires. So then we get down to the 6 months or so, 3 to 6 months out from the actual transition. This is when you make the hire. This is when you want to internally communicate and announce. Also publicly, you want to announce that you've hired the new CEO. And then you also want to, I should have talked about onboarding earlier, and I'm sorry I missed that. Early on earlier on in the process, when we put that CEO profile together, we also want to build sort of the beginning of an onboarding plan. How are we, when we bring this new person in, what are those key things that they need to understand in the organization to assimilate well and to make this as seamless as possible? But you really can't complete that onboarding plan until you've made that hire, because it's going to make a difference. The person that you bring in is going to make a little bit difference in the onboarding plan. So there may be specific things that you need this person to develop. There may be just certain things that you need this person to understand and get out and meet with all of your clients, and of course meet with all the employee owners and so forth. So completing that plan and making sure that's in place and solid for that day one when that person comes in is important as well.
All right, I think I have one question here that would apply. Then there's a lot coming in, Mike, but we'll try and get to some of them toward the end. Brian asks, what's the best way to develop complete job descriptions for these functional titles? For example, developing key results area, overall job function, and how the position wins, especially when we don't have the role right now in our organization.
Sorry, can you repeat that? Repeat that one more time.
It's a little bit long. What's the best way to develop a complete job description for functional titles? For example, developing key results, overall job function, and how the position wins, especially when we don't have the right role now in our organization.
Okay. So when you say functional, I'm assuming you're talking about the roles that are not the CEO role, that are the roles that are ultimately going to report to the new CEO in the new organization, the growing organization. How do you build those job descriptions? It really starts with what needs to get done in that functional area. So what needs to happen? Let's just take sales, for example. If today we have 5 products and we're selling in 5 states, but we know that to become in the next stage, we need to sell nationwide, and we need to increase the number of products by 3 times. So we need to have 15 or 20 different products. It starts with that. So this leader in sales needs to be able to now sell 20 different product lines, needs to lead X amount of people across your organization, needs to lead X amount of locations that very different in terms of, all from one location versus various locations around the country. Also looking at, now this person probably needs to lead leaders instead of just leading salespeople. So we kind of start with those key things that need to get done, and then build out the bullet points underneath that in terms of, okay, well then what would their experience need to have been in their career? What are the things that they need to develop and so forth? Hopefully that answers the question.
I think it does. Hopefully we answered that for you, Brian. Okay,
Thumbs
one
up from
other.
it's floating across the screen.
Yes. We have one other from Chris here. If the new CEO is an internal hire, how might the individual handle the simultaneous transition of learning the new position and mentoring their replacement?
That is a challenge and a very important facet of this. So I would say the short answer to that is to get some help in that. There could be hiring someone to come in as an executive coach or doing leadership development and so forth to work between that person who's been put into the CEO chair and the person that fills in behind them, to really make sure that the development is being done, and also kind of makes it easier for that CEO. The new CEO is going to be extremely busy with all kinds of new challenges and new things that they're diving into. And so having some help with that is quite honestly the best I can say, because otherwise that new CEO is spending a lot of time kind of in their old role and not able to be fully, working in their CEO role. So it is a challenge.
Perfect. All right, let's keep moving along and then we'll try and get to a few more.
Okay. Got another polling question. This one's a true or false. The best time to communicate to employee owners about the CEO transition is after you've hired the new CEO placement.
All right, here's our final polling question required for continuing education credit. If you want that CE credit, please make sure that you answer here, not in the Q&A box, but here in the polling question box. And we'll give it about 20 more seconds. And hopefully we should have plenty of time to get to more questions. I know Jeremy, Mark, Ken, and Jeff, you still have outstanding questions and I see them, we will get to them. All right, I'm gonna end this one here. Oh, there's a few more if you wanna answer. I see a few more folks that have not completed the poll yet that previously had. So you may be looking for CE. Last 5 seconds, anyone? No? Okay, here is the result, Mike.
Okay. Actually, yeah, the answer here, the correct answer here is false. And this may be just slightly unfair because I'm not sure that I addressed this specifically as we've gone through here. You certainly want to communicate after you've made the CEO hire, absolutely. But it's important to be communicating with employee owners along the way as you're going through this transition. Of course, early in the transition, that 4 to 5 years, even 3 to 4 years out, you can't be communicating with employee owners if you don't know what that date is yet for transition, and there's not some of that key work hasn't been done yet. But once that has been done and you really are moving forward with a process, you should be communicating with employee owners along the way. And the reason for that is because anytime a change like this is happening, people are anxious, and you want to make sure that people are happy and productive and well engaged in the organization as you're going through this. And just by communicating, it's not going to take away all the anxiousness, but it can help a lot to know that there's a process in place and that you're following it and moving toward a conclusion.
All right, yep, we can keep going. There you
Okay.
go.
All right, so what I see a lot of times with the boards that I work with, it's like we made the hire, we're done. Well, we don't have to do anything else, but that's not the way it works. So you do need to really be thinking about, after the hire is actually made, that 30, 60, 90 day and 1 year plan in terms of your onboarding plan. Obviously, it starts out with some very basic things and getting to know folks and customers and things like that, and then gets into how are we going to tie the new CEO into our strategic plan? What are those key metrics that we're expecting from key deliverables we're expecting from the new CEO, from the board, and so forth. So really setting that up and spending a lot of time in that first 30, 60, 90 days in particular to make sure that those early wins are happening in the organization goes a long, long way to making sure that this is a good long-term fit and match. Okay, just real quickly, some do's and don'ts. So get started as early as possible. Don't worry if if you're already within the 3 years of transition, that's okay. Just get started and get going with some of these activities to make sure that you can make this as seamless as possible. Make sure you are communicating. This kind of ties back to that last true and false question why I said that was a little unfair. You're communicating from the board, you're communicating to the senior leadership team, and you're communicating broadly to the employee owners appropriately with each of those as you go. And then don'ts is kind of the opposite of this. So don't wait too long, just get started wherever you are. You absolutely don't want to skip the background work. So that means having a solid board in place, doing that strategic planning, making sure you do evaluations of your internal candidates, your internal senior leaders. The other thing that is important here is in terms of those evaluations is that you are looking at, again, just by the nature of the strategic planning process, we're saying we're going to be a bigger organization in the future. So this is a lot of times where organizations that we work with, they kind of start their first real succession planning process and leadership development process, and because there's going to be other roles as well. We're not just looking for the CEO. They're also looking for who can lead those functional areas when the company's bigger and who can lead departments and things like that down into the organization. So it's a good time to start kind of looking all the way across the organization. Don't be passive. If the board, this is really your highest calling. This is the most important responsibility that you have as a board director. So don't be afraid to start discussing transition, start planning. Sometimes, it's human nature for CEOs to not think that they're ever going to be stepping out of the role, and sometimes they actually don't want to communicate to people that they're thinking about it because they don't want to scare people. But it's the board's responsibility to make sure you're discussing these things and moving toward the conclusion. And then just don't assume that people know and don't assume that they don't know. If you're a CEO and you're reaching that near retirement age, people probably are going to think that you are thinking about transition, and don't assume either way. Communicate with folks because it makes it a lot better overall, and people are feel more comfortable if they know what's happening. Okay. Back to the roadmap, and I'm glad to take any questions here, Jamie.
All right, we're going to go. We've got quite a few. All right, Mark asks, can you comment on board makeup, governance, and roles pre-ESOP and post-ESOP? That's the first part of the question. And the second is, can you comment on two-step ESOP transitions, 40 step 1 and 100% step 2? Don't know if this is your expertise.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit in terms of boards. Pre-ESOP boards depends a little bit on what pre-ESOP boards the ESOP board has been, but what I believe the best setup for an ESOP board is to have, as I said, at least 2 independent directors. You want those independent directors to have complementary skills. Oftentimes board directors are either retired CEOs or active CEOs or CFOs from other companies. So I'd like to see when you have one of those people who's a very strong financial individual, and maybe the other who's more of a sales and marketing coming up through their career, or strategy person coming up through their career. So having good balance that way on the board, a set of experiences, and then oftentimes with these ESOPs, there will be internal directors on the board as well. That could be the current CEO, but also some other on the senior leadership team. And again, I think it's important to have kind of that balance there of skill sets on the board. Pre-ESOP, I don't always see that balance. And so I think that's important when you do become an ESOP to create that balance. And then it's always nice to have one of those independent directors at least have some ESOP experience as well. Have been in an ESOP for both cultural reasons and for more technical reasons around the ESOP. And I'm sorry, what's the second half of the question, Jamie?
Let's see. The second half is scrolling, sorry. Comment on two-step ESOP transition, 40% for the first transaction and 100 then to 100% for step two.
Okay. I would look at that the same way, is that I think that at least in terms of the board, I'm not sure if the question's pertaining particularly to the board, but again, having that solid balance and having some folks on the board that have ESOP experience in another ESOP or another company, I think is important, especially when you make that jump to the 100%.
Perfect. I have a really good one. This next one's, I'm very interested to hear your answer on this. So we're considering 3 candidates for the CE role to replace the current CEO who's going to retire. How can we make sure that we keep the 2 who don't get the job?
Yeah, okay. That is a juicy one. I think it really is, it's all about communication. I think I mentioned this a little bit in terms of that, obviously only one of those candidates can get the job. But I think when you have a strong strategic plan, you have a strong vision for the future, assuming you want to keep those other 2 individuals, there's going to be more for them to take on in the organization. So the roles are going to change. The roles may grow. There may be new roles. If the company's moving in the right direction, there should be other places for them to play. And so hopefully you can communicate to them that, you're a keeper. We love you. We want to keep you here. We think you can contribute to the organization in other ways, but we can only choose one CEO. And most of the time I've seen that be successful. There have been a few situations I've seen where people just don't accept that. But most of the time I've seen that be successful if you're communicating with them well enough in advance. And I really tried to press too that, you really don't want to kind of create just that contest for the CEO role. I think when you start this looking at your internal candidates, you really want to create more of a broader kind of succession plan for the whole leadership team, instead of saying, hey, we're setting up a competition here to see who becomes the CEO. Because of that reason I just mentioned, that the organization is going to evolve and change, and there's going to be other places for people to play.
Thanks, Mike. Next one comes from Jeremy. How can we evaluate whether a candidate possesses a company's core values? It seems like a candidate that wants the job will answer yes to the questions, even though the candidate may not actually possess those values.
Yeah, you have to be a little bit sneaky. So you have to develop behavioral-based interview questions that get around the core values that you're looking for. So candidates, especially at senior levels, are going to be smart. They're going to read your core value statement on your website. They're going to see some things that that are pertaining to your culture and so forth. So building behavioral-based questions, asking for examples of how they've lived out certain things. And I usually try to do that in a way where I'm not even asking, kind of putting that core values word into the question. I may say, tell me about how you've handled a team where you had to make changes to the team, and walk me through how you've done that. Tell me about a team that you inherited that wasn't working well together. And really, a big part of it, I think, is really understanding what is it that you're listening for, and knowing the core values that you're listening for in there. So how did they handle that? How did they treat people through that process? How does that pertain to your, to your core values? That's the best way that I know how to do that. And then to have multiple people involved. So, you're going to have interviews at the board level. You're going to have interviews, with a senior leadership team. You may bring in some others as well, some outside consultants and things like that may be involved in interview processes, but all putting your heads together after those interviews and saying, okay, did we all hear the same thing? And do we agree on, that fit around our values or not fit?
That's perfect. All right. Jeff asks, are there any unique differences in your process for the CEO transition and search process that you do differently for an ESOP that you would not do for an organization that's not an ESOP?
It's a great question. Yes, and it really has to do with those core values. We actually have kind of a model that we use for ESOPs that, really there's really kind of three key things that we're looking for. I mean, there's the skill set piece. There's the unique core values of the organization piece that we're looking for a match there. And then there's also something we call our leadership characteristics for ESOPs, because I found that working with ESOPs over 20 plus years, that there are some really key leadership things that work well in ESOPs and don't, things that don't work well within ESOPs as it pertains to leadership. So real quickly, those 5 things are, consistent communication. The person has to be a consistent communicator. They have to be a champion of people development. They have to be a true listener to be able to take in ideas and feedback. And they also have to be able to make decisions as well, and move things forward. Sometimes we see that leaders in ESOPs can worry a little bit too much about being popular and listen, and keep listening forever and never move things forward. So those are the key things that we look for differently in the ESOP.
All right, Gracie, we have time for your question. She was worried, but we're going to get it in. All right, they're currently onboarding their next VP of Ops, who was hired with the long-term vision of them as the next CEO within the 3 to 5 year range. Looks like the current CEO and board and executive team are very hopeful and aligned that they'll likely be a great successor. Any advice for us along the way?
Yeah. Still make sure you go through that process of identifying what does that CEO, the next stage CEO look like. I think it's easy to bring someone in like that and then just kind of say, well, let's see if they make it or not, but not having a template of what are they making it to. And so I think that's really, really important. And that constant communication, I think, is really important as well. Between the board and this person that you brought in, to make sure just that there's no missed expectations in terms of goals and objectives and what we're expecting you to do to make it to the next, to develop to make it to the CEO slot. And that is a little tricky, because you may find yourself in a situation where they're really great in that COO or VP of Ops role, but maybe board may not feel that they are capable of being the next CEO, and then you're kind of in a tough spot again to not put that person into the CEO role. So again, that communication and kind of real clear expectations are really, really important.
All right, we have time for, I think, one more before we end for today. But for those of you that we did not get to, I will pass the questions on to Mike, and him and his team can reach out to you to discuss the answers. But Josh asks, does Strategic Talent Partners, do they engage in board of director searches for ESOP companies?
We do, as a matter of fact, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Well, that's all that we have time for today. Thank you, Mike, so much for joining us and helping us make good long-term decisions in regards to our executives here in our ESOP companies. We really appreciate all your time today. And again, for those of you those 2 that we did not get to for questions, I will pass them on to Mike, and then you'll have his contact information in the follow-up email. Follow-up email will also come within 2 hours. It'll have where to get your CE credit, a recording today, as well as a link to the slides. Thank you everyone for being here today. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.